the dusty outskirts of Abeokuta, where gossip traveled faster than the Harmattan wind and secrets rarely survived the night, everyone knew the name Kunle Adeyemi, not because he was successful, but because he was a disappointment. Kunle was young, tall, and strong, with no sickness in his body and no visible burden on his shoulders. Yet he lived like a shadow. Years earlier, he had dropped out of school without shame, claiming education was useless and stressful. While other boys his age learned trades, struggled through university, or chased apprenticeships, Kunle chose the comfort of his mother's house. From morning till night, he sat inside the spacious living room of Madam Funke Adeyemi's compound. A controller rested permanently in his hands, his eyes glued to a glowing screen. He played games endlessly, ate food prepared by house help, and slept like a man who believed tomorrow owed him nothing. Days melted into weeks, and weeks into years, until time itself seemed tired of waiting for Kunle to grow up. Madam Funke Adeyemi was one of the wealthiest women in the area. She owned several shops in Kuto Market, rented out houses, and lent money to traders who spoke her name with respect. Elders greeted her warmly, and neighbors envied her success. But behind the high walls of her compound, her heart was constantly heavy. Every morning, as she watched her son still asleep while other young men walked past the gate on their way to work, she whispered the same painful prayer. "Oh God, why me? Why did you give me a son like this?" She tried everything a mother could try. She begged, she shouted, she advised. She even cried before Kunle, kneeling on the tiled floor one night with tears soaking her wrapper. "Kunle," she said, her voice breaking, "I will not live forever. When I am gone, what will you do with your life?" Kunle barely looked up from his screen. "You worry too much, Mama," he said casually. "Everything will be fine." She used her influence to find him jobs, many jobs. A warehouse assistant, a mechanic's helper, a shop supervisor through one of her friends. Each time, Kunle lasted less than a week. Sometimes he arrived late on purpose. Sometimes he ignored instructions. Other times, he deliberately disrespected his supervisors so they would fire him and send him back home to his games. Soon, employers stopped answering Madam Funke's calls. The village talked. A rich woman with a useless son, some said. Money cannot buy discipline, others whispered. A child who eats without sweat will one day taste hunger, the elders warned. Kunle ignored them all, until one evening changed the direction of his life. That evening, at a small fabric stall near the market, Kunle met Aisha Bello. Aisha was calm, soft-spoken, and hard-working. She sold fabrics with her aunt and carried herself with quiet dignity. She dreamed of a peaceful home, a responsible husband, and children who would never beg in the streets. When Kunle saw her, fear entered his heart, not fear of love, but fear of exposure. So he lied. He spoke confidently about ambition. He dressed better. He woke up early whenever Aisha visited. He talked about business ideas, investments, and the future man he was becoming. Aisha listened. She believed him. Love closed her eyes to the small inconsistencies. Even Madam Funke, though doubtful, allowed herself hope. Maybe marriage will wake him, she thought. They married in a modest but joyful ceremony. Neighbors celebrated, prayers were said. For a short while, Kunle kept the mask on. He pretended to be responsible. He pretended to be serious. But truth has a way of breathing. Soon after Aisha gave birth to their son, Sadiq, reality entered their home, like an uninvited guest. Kunle stopped pretending. He returned to his old habits. Jobs came and went like bad dreams. His mother kept intervening, and employers kept firing him. Bills piled up. Food became a daily argument. Shame crept back into the house. Kunle, our child needs milk, Aisha cried one night. Must I kill myself working? Kunle snapped. You are not working at all. The arguments grew louder. Neighbors began to listen through the walls. Respect faded. One evening, after Kunle returned home fired again, Aisha packed her bags. I will not raise my child in this house of excuses, she said, her voice shaking but firm. When you decide to become a man, maybe then you can find us. She left with Sadiq. Kunle ran to his mother's house, desperate. Mama, help me, he begged. She has left me. Madam Funke looked at him for a long time, longer than she ever had. Years of disappointment filled her eyes. No, she said quietly. I raised you with comfort, and it ruined you. Hunger will teach you what love could not. She closed the gate. That night, Kunle slept outside for the first time in his life. That night outside the gate marked the true beginning of Kunle Adeyemi's education. The concrete was cold, the darkness unfamiliar, and the silence loud with memories he had spent years avoiding. Mosquitoes feasted on his skin. Hunger twisted his stomach into painful knots. For the first time, no one brought him food, no one called his name, and no one cared whether he was comfortable. As dawn crept over Abeokuta, Kunle sat up, exhausted and ashamed, and realized that comfort had abandoned him completely. The days that followed were merciless. Kunle walked the streets searching for work, his clothes dusty, his pride broken. He knocked on gates, entered shops, and stood before supervisors who barely listened. Each rejection sounded the same. No certificate, no discipline, no recommendation. Some laughed softly, others waved him away. By evening, he returned to abandoned corners to sleep, surviving on scraps and water begged from strangers. Hunger humbled him faster than any sermon his mother had ever preached. On the fifth day, Kunle collapsed beside a half-built structure, dizzy and weak. A man with rough hands and a stern face stood over him. He was Mr. Okonkwo, a construction foreman, known for his hard rules and harder work. He studied Kunle's trembling body and asked one simple question. Can you work? Kunle nodded desperately. Mr. Okonkwo handed him a shovel. If you stop moving, you leave. Construction life was brutal. Cement burned Kunle's palms raw. His back screamed with every load he carried. Senior workers shouted insults when he slowed down. Yet each evening, when he collapsed onto the ground, Kunle felt something new growing inside him. It was not pride. It was responsibility. If he failed, he starved. If he worked, he survived. Slowly, his body hardened and his excuses disappeared. During those early weeks of construction, temptation followed Kunle like a stubborn shadow. Each payday, some workers disappeared into bars and betting shops. They mocked Kunle when he refused to join them, calling him old before his time. One evening, a former friend recognized him near the site and laughed loudly. So this is where the rich woman's son ended up? The words pierced Kunle's chest, but he swallowed his anger and returned to work. That night, he promised himself that no insult would push him backward. Mr. Okonkwo noticed the change. He began assigning Kunle heavier responsibilities, trusting him with tools and time. One afternoon, the foreman called him aside. Hard work can save you, he said, but direction will change you. He spoke about discipline, about men who failed not because they were weak, but because they were careless with time. Those words stayed with Kunle long after the day ended. Weeks passed. Kunle learned to wake before sunrise. He learned to obey instructions. He learned that respect was earned with sweat. One night, sitting beside other laborers, he listened as they spoke about technology jobs in Lagos, about people who worked with computers instead of shovels. The idea haunted him. He returned to his sleeping place restless, repeating one sentence to himself. Time is still breathing. With savings scraped together from construction work, Kunle enrolled in a small IT training center. The transition was painful. His mind, once lazy, resisted focus. He failed tests. He doubted himself. Many nights he wanted to quit. But hunger and shame stood guard over his discipline. He studied before work and after work, refusing distractions. Slowly, knowledge replaced fear. At the IT center, Kunle met people younger and smarter than him. At first, shame made him silent. He struggled with basic concepts and almost quit when his first project failed completely. He returned home that night and stared at the ceiling, hearing his mother's old prayers echo in his mind. Instead of running, he opened his laptop and started again. Failure became his teacher. The first breakthrough came when he solved a problem no one else could. The instructor looked at him with surprise. From that day, Kunle studied harder. His confidence grew quietly. When he secured his first contract job, he sent money anonymously to Aisha for Sadiq's needs. He did not announce it. He simply acted. Months later, Kunle secured a junior role at a small tech firm. His first salary felt unreal. He paid rent. He ate without begging. He saved. Promotions followed. Confidence returned, not as arrogance, but as quiet certainty. When his mother's name came up in conversations, he no longer flinched. One morning, dressed simply but firmly, Kunle returned to Madam Funke's gate. At first, she refused to listen, but when she saw proof, tears broke her resistance. She embraced him with shaking hands. "My son," she whispered, "you have finally arrived." Together, they visited Aisha. She listened silently as Kunle knelt and spoke without excuses. He did not promise miracles. He promised effort. She did not answer immediately. She watched him over months. She tested his consistency. She saw actions replace words. Reuniting with his son was the hardest moment. Sadiq did not recognize him at first. Kunle knelt, fighting tears, and introduced himself slowly. Aisha watched closely, guarding her heart. Over time, she saw patience replace excuses. She saw presence replace promises. When Aisha finally agreed to return, it was not because Kunle was rich. It was because he was consistent. He listened. He worked. He apologized without defending himself. The home they rebuilt was quieter, humbler, and stronger. Years later, Kunle would often wake before dawn, even on days when he did not need to. He would sit quietly, watching his son sleep, listening to Aisha breathe, and remembering the version of himself that almost destroyed everything. He never blamed his mother again. Instead, he thanked her for the hardest lesson she ever taught him. Whenever young men approached him asking for shortcuts, Kunle told them the truth. "There are none," he said, "only consequences." He invested in training others, supported apprentices, and returned regularly to the construction site where his transformation began. greeting Mr. Okonkwo with respect. Aisha herself changed through the journey. The bitterness she once carried softened into wisdom. She taught Sadiq the value of effort, reminding him gently of where his father had come from. Their home became a place of honesty, where mistakes were corrected, not hidden. Kunle accepted correction without anger, understanding that leadership began with listening. On quiet evenings, the family shared meals without excess, laughter without pride. Wealth no longer defined success. Stability did, respect did, and above all, discipline did. The past was not erased, but it no longer ruled them. It stood behind them as proof that broken beginnings do not decide final outcomes, and that even the most stubborn life can be reshaped by humility and work. At a community gathering months later, Madam Funke stood proudly beside her son. Elders nodded in approval. Children listened as Kunle spoke about discipline and consequences. His story traveled faster than gossip ever had. Kunle carried that truth forward, knowing redemption is not a moment but a lifetime practice, guarded daily by choice, effort, and memory, until character becomes stronger than temptation and the future finally respects the man who earned it. That was his lasting victory. I hope you enjoyed the story. If so, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more interesting and exciting tales.